You're just a parasite living off of me. If you have a complaint, divorce me and get out."
The beer he flung at me out of the blue, along with those words, left me stunned. Has he forgotten all that I had done till now? It's impossible for me to spend a lifetime with such a person. "All right," I said, and left the home that I had lived with my husband for many years. I couldn't possibly stand being called a parasite in silence. My name is Lisa Parker. I'm a 42-year-old housewife. My husband, Mark, is 4 years older than me at 46 and works for the local county office. We've been married for 12 years. We initially both worked, but I quit my job 5 years into our marriage. I actually wanted to continue working. I thought I'd have a child right after getting married, but I started feeling impatient as 2 years passed with no baby. I keenly felt the silent pressure from my in-laws who wanted to see their grandchild. When my mother-in-law finally said, "Is it because you're working that you can't have a child?" I decided to quit my job. I decided to focus on fertility treatments. Many people continue working while undergoing fertility treatments. But I've always had a weak constitution and was anxious about treatments while working. I remember Mark being happy when I quit my job and became a full-time housewife. He assured me that it would be easy to support me on his income alone. Despite quitting my job and becoming a housewife, we still don't have children. Mark was very supportive of the fertility treatments. We both loved children and wanted to have one soon. I think I felt a little rushed when my in-laws said they wanted to see their grandchild soon. There was a tremendous struggle before I came to the understanding that having a child doesn't necessarily go according to plan. 5 years have passed since then, and we're no longer undergoing fertility treatments. We tried various things, but we were not blessed with a child. Both Mark and I have had thorough examinations. We thought there might be a problem with one of us. I've heard that many husbands are reluctant to get tested. That was not the case with Mark. I remember feeling relieved when he willingly took the tests. The results showed that we were both healthy and normal, so it seems to be a matter of luck. Also, my health was at its limit to continue the fertility treatments. When I told Mark that I was taking a break from the treatments, his reaction was more intense than I had imagined.
"What are you talking about now? Do you know how much the treatments have cost us? Are you planning to continue being a housewife without even undergoing treatments?"
He kept blaming me and kept bringing up the cost of treatments. Yes, I know the treatments were expensive and difficult. I felt guilty, and I covered most of the treatment costs with my savings from when I was single. Despite knowing that, Mark kept saying that his hard-earned money was being wasted.
"Hold on, that's too harsh. You know my body's at its limit, don't you?"
Mark, who only talks about money without any words of concern for his wife's body, finally got to me. That really got my goat. I couldn't help but retort back in a loud voice.
"If that's the case, you shouldn't have suggested infertility treatments in the first place."
I, who usually never talk back, opposed, and it seemed Mark didn't like that. Yet, he couldn't seem to strongly rebut me. Perhaps he was remembering that he too had agreed to fertility treatments. That day, he left the house and didn't return for quite a while. We had a few fights about the treatment afterward, but things have somehow recently settled down. Maybe Mark has given up on the idea of having a child. I feel guilty about that, but I think we just have to accept that it was our fate. Life as just a couple isn't bad. That's what I kept telling myself. My classmates who have kids seem to be having a hard time financially. Many of my friends continue to work to secure their children's future and their own old age. Mark never outright says it, but he seems unsatisfied with me quitting the treatment and becoming a housewife. After much thought, I decided to start a side job that I could do from home. Immediately, I told Mark about it when he came home from work. Mark laughed at my story as if it was a joke. If it were that easy to make money, nobody would go out to work. Starting with those words, he started to endlessly talk about how busy he is working during the day. Most of it was complaints about dealing with the public. Mark, whose main job is dealing with the public at the counter, seems to be under a lot of stress.
"A job you can do from home? Well, at least make enough for my allowance. Not that I'm expecting much."
Mark ended the conversation like that. I think Mark probably didn't understand even half of what I said. If he had understood, he wouldn't have reacted like that. I tried to explain again, but Mark was no longer listening. Don't try to enjoy working from home, just go get a part-time job somewhere. As I tried to start speaking, Mark turned a displeased face toward me. Mark somehow has the perception that he's the only one working. This won't do for a conversation. I decided in my heart not to talk about my side job until I can proudly tell Mark about the money I've earned. And so, I started a side job from home. Mark remains unchanged, not promoted, and always in the same department. It's rare for a public servant to be in the same department for over 3 years. It seems that he is thought to be unhelpful in other departments. Mark, who has been left behind while his peers are steadily being promoted, seems more stressed than ever, which I can tell. Firstly, the amount of alcohol he consumes at home has increased. Of course, the number of times he comes home drunk after drinking outside has also increased. Moreover, he always comes home completely drunk. And the next day, he would take the day off due to a hangover. This would surely affect his attendance record. On top of that, he didn't like me constantly on the computer even on my days off and had started going to the slot machines, something he had never done before. Sometimes he wins, but most of the time he loses. I once told Mark that it's a waste of money and suggested he find another hobby. Mark retorted, "What do you know?" before storming out. He returned late at night, thoroughly drunk. When I was called out to the front door in response to a loud call, the taxi driver was supporting Mark, who seemed unable to stand on his own due to his drunkenness. I dumped Mark in his room next to the entrance as he was. The taxi driver said apologetically, "I haven't received the fare yet." I planned to pay it from Mark's wallet, so I found his wallet and checked it. It was completely empty. He probably blew it all at the casino. In a hurry, I paid the taxi fare from my own wallet that I had left in the kitchen. I wonder what he would have done if I hadn't been home when he took a taxi home drunk and penniless. The next morning, Mark woke up with his usual hangover. He claimed to have no memory of the previous night. "You've been drinking too much lately. It's not good for your health, be careful." As I handed him a hangover remedy and water, Mark made a somewhat malicious expression. I braced myself for some sarcastic comment, but he said nothing. But I am certain that he harbors some dissatisfaction with my words deep down. Proof of that is that he has stopped making eye contact with me entirely. Despite it being a much-awaited weekend, Mark shuts himself in his bedroom due to his hangover. After finishing house chores, I sat down in front of my computer to do my work. Public servants have a 2-day weekend. I decided to be lenient and let him enjoy his heavy drinking on a Saturday. With these thoughts in mind, I start my work. At first, I was worried about Mark, but as I focused on my work, I completely forgot about him. Time flies when you're focused. Before I knew it, it was Sunday evening. Mark's hangover was severe, and he was unable to eat lunch. As night approaches, he seems to be somewhat back to his usual condition. I was focused on my work until Mark, who spent his day off lounging in bed, called out, "Dinner."
Huh? Is it that time already? I didn't notice because I was so focused.
Startled by Mark's voice, I checked the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 p.m.
Hurry up, I'm hungry.
Mark, leaning on the entrance door with his arms crossed, looked disgruntled. Indeed, I had completely forgotten about dinner. That was my mistake. Feeling sorry, I left my computer. I hadn't done any shopping, so I had to make dinner with what was left in the refrigerator. I prepared dinner in a hurry. While I was busily preparing dinner in the kitchen, Mark was sprawled out on the living room sofa, doing nothing. From time to time, he called out, "Isn't it ready yet?"
"It'll be ready soon, sorry. Please wait a bit." "You're slow, hurry up. You're a stay-at-home wife, and you can't even do this right."
As Mark continued to complain while lying around, I gradually became irritated. If he was so hungry, he could at least help a little. I felt my remorse gradually changing into resentment towards Mark. My movements as I prepared dinner became rougher. He must have heard the sounds in the living room. I heard a sharp tisk from the living room. Because of all this, the atmosphere at dinner was terrible. Watching Mark eat his meal in silence with a sullen face, I felt fed up. It must have shown on my face. Suddenly, Mark splashed the beer he was drinking at me. Caught off guard by the cold beer in my face, I was momentarily stunned. The beer was chilled and I certainly hadn't expected such an action from Mark. Beer was dripping from my chin.
If you have a problem living off my hard work, you parasite, then get a divorce and get out.
His face, flushed red, probably from the alcohol, was shouting at me, still stunned. He kept grumbling even after his outburst.
A parasite? You think of me as a parasite?
I asked Mark, looking straight at him. It upset me more to be called a parasite than having beer thrown at me. I need him to correct those words and apologize no matter what. At my thoughts, Mark snorted in derision.
Don't feel like you're working just because you do a little side job for pocket money. You're not working. You're spending all of my earnings and savings on infertility treatments, and even after all that, we don't have a child. You stopped the treatment because you were feeling unwell and remain a housewife.
Mark began his usual rant about how much stress he's under from work. Indeed, being a public service clerk likely involved a lot of complaints. I empathize with that, but it was Mark who chose this job. He should simply do his job without constantly complaining about it.
If we were both working, my hardships would have been less. I might have quit this job I hate. I'm working and enduring for your sake.
Mark was blaming me for all the stress from his work. I was truly taken aback. I don't remember him being like this. Maybe his personality changed as he watched his peers climb up the career ladder. Seeing me listening silently, Mark smirked unpleasantly. He seemed to mistake my silence for my inability to argue back. Truthfully, I was just too astounded to speak.
If you have complaints, then let's divorce.
Mark repeated the word divorce again. Does he think that mentioning divorce will make me reflect on my actions and apologize?
Understood,
I replied calmly. I had nothing else to say to Mark. If he wants to make a fuss about divorce, then let's divorce. Determined, I wiped the beer off with a towel that was nearby. It was sticky and uncomfortable.
I'll leave.
I got up and opened the drawer where I keep my important belongings. In there was a divorce paper that we had written together as a precaution to stay close to each other when we first got married. I never thought we would have to use it. The divorce paper already has both of our signatures. We just need to fill in the date and submit it.
Mark, remember this? The divorce paper we wrote when we first got married. It's a pity that we have to use it.
I opened the divorce paper in front of Mark to show him. Mark seemed to have completely forgotten the existence of the divorce papers, his eyes wavering a bit in shock. My affection for him cooled immediately, making me think he wasn't really serious about the word divorce. I was so mad at myself for not seeing that he was such a small-minded man. I neatly folded the divorce papers and tucked them into my pocket.
Hurry up and get a lawyer to process this. I'll feel refreshed once I get rid of this parasite. Get it over with quickly.
I finished my dinner and left the dining table as it was. I returned to my room, quickly packing only what I needed into my bag. Mark was still drinking beer in the dining room, but I decided to leave the house without saying a word to him. Honestly, I didn't want to see Mark's face anymore. I boarded the train and returned to my parents' house. My parents' home is about an hour and a half away by train. My mother looked surprised to see me come home without any notice, but she seemed to sense something was wrong by my demeanor. I'm home. When I said that in a small voice, my mother warmly welcomed me with welcome back. Whether it was the relief from hearing my mother's voice, I don't know, but I ended up sitting down right at the front door. My father, wondering what was going on, also showed his face at the entrance. Seeing me sitting down at the entrance, he seemed to sense something was wrong as well. And so, I returned to the comfort of my parents' home. Once I had calmed down a bit, I told my parents what had happened tonight. My parents, who knew that I, who had been frail since I was a child, had been working hard on infertility treatments, were beyond angry and flabbergasted at Mark's lack of consideration. When I finally told them that I was called a parasite, my father slammed his teacup down on the table. The noise was so loud that both my mother and I were startled. Looking at me, my father said quietly, "Fight this through to the end." The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. I went straight to the lawyer's office. My marriage to Mark will be over soon. After visiting the lawyer's office, on the way home, I passed by the town hall where my husband works. There was Mark. As I thought about our life as a married couple, there weren't many good memories. Thinking it couldn't be, I thought back to our newlywed life with Mark, but indeed, there were no wonderful memories. I was convinced in my mind that we divorced because we were meant to divorce. While Mark was at work, I returned to the house where we had been living together and quickly moved out my belongings. It would be impossible for me to do it alone, so I asked my father and brother to lend me a car. Thinking that some heavy lifting would be necessary, even my cousins who lived nearby came to help. At this time, all the men in my family unanimously said, "We thought you would divorce." Even my brother had said he didn't like Mark from the time of the wedding.
Why didn't you oppose my marriage then?
I couldn't help but blurt it out. My father and brothers laughed out loud at my words. Apparently, they had opposed it, and I had just forgotten. Just like the saying "love is blind," I was infatuated with Mark before our marriage. Opposing opinions probably didn't reach me. I felt a little embarrassed, realizing that memory is something that can be overwritten to suit one's convenience. After removing the necessary items, I wrote a letter to Mark. I left a note stating that my lawyer is processing the divorce, and that I had already moved out my belongings, so he could do as he pleased with the rest. I tried to think of something nice to add, but nothing came to mind. Finishing the letter brought me an incredible sense of relief, to the point where I was surprised at myself. The moment I locked the front door and threw the keys into the mailbox, I felt like dancing. I realized that my marriage to Mark had been a continual exercise in patience. I had braced myself for Mark's immediate contact, but there was none on the day I moved out, or the day after. Then, 3 days after I left the house, I spent the day shopping with my mother for the first time in a long while. It was partly a change of pace, but I also wanted to thank my mother who had accepted me back home without saying anything. As it was nearly Father's Day, I decided to pick out a gift for my father with her. After enjoying the shopping, we returned home a bit past 6 p.m. I had unintentionally left my cell phone at home, and I hurriedly checked it when I got back. There were a terrifying number of calls and emails from Mark. Among Mark's calls, there were also calls from a friend. He's probably asking around my friends for my whereabouts. I felt sorry for the trouble I had caused my friends. As I was wondering whether or not to contact Mark, my phone buzzed, notifying me of an incoming call. When I checked the screen, it was Mark calling. I knew I couldn't keep running away forever, so I decided to pick up.
"Lisa, where are you? Things are really bad."
The moment I answered the phone, Mark's yelling filled my ears. He sounded very frantic, and I couldn't make out the words he was blurting out.
"Huh? What? I've already submitted the divorce papers. We're practically strangers now. I don't know what's so bad, but it doesn't concern me, does it?"
I deliberately spoke slowly. I hoped that it would further irritate Mark. My provocation easily riled up Mark.
"You just went and hired a lawyer on your own."
He made it sound like I had done everything on my own, even though he was the one who had initiated the divorce. This really got on my nerves.
"Hold on a minute. Remember, you were the one who wanted a divorce, right, Mark? Feeling liberated now that the parasite is gone, are we? Oh, did you realize that maybe you're the parasite?"
At my words, I could hear Mark catching his breath on the other end of the line. I had expected the call would come soon.
"Did you think I didn't know about your debt?"
Actually, Mark had a debt. It was a debt he had accumulated from gambling. It was about 5 years ago when I found out that he was deeply in debt from casino and boat racing. Mark's excuse was terrible. He seemed to think that since I was spending money on infertility treatments, he should be able to spend as well. I remember being confused when he told me that. In the end, we promised to repay this debt together. Mark, who had cried and promised never to gamble again, continued to do so, and I knew it.
"Did you think you could repay your debt and live a normal life on just the living expenses you give me?"
Mark was silent on the other end of the line. Mark used to hand over the living expenses from his salary to me, and he was free to use the rest as he wished. At first, he would give me the money to repay his debts separately from the living expenses, but eventually, the debt repayment money stopped being included in the living expenses envelope. He had fallen into gambling.
Let me guess, you've been borrowing money from your family to repay the debts, haven't you? Are you mooching off them too?
Mark spat out with as much sarcasm as he could muster. He seemed to think that I was borrowing money from my family to meet the monthly debt repayments. He even seemed to know that the money he was giving me wasn't enough to repay the debt.
I haven't borrowed a single penny from my family. I've been repaying your debts with the money I earned from my side job. But now that we are strangers, I don't have any obligation to repay your debts. Did you really think that you could live a normal life while repaying debts with your salary alone?
Mark must have called because he'd been contacted by his creditor. The money he borrowed wasn't from a particularly reputable source. He borrowed from banks, maxed out his credit cards, and ended up in debt to financial companies. There was some debt collection involved. It seems they contacted his workplace. He was panicking.
So, it's not me who is the parasite. You were my parasite, Mark. Stop lying. You can't possibly have made that much money from a woman's work-at-home job. Stop showing off. Just go borrow some money from your family and pay it back.
Mark was always looking down on me. I couldn't help but sigh in disbelief.
My side job is affiliate marketing. You could look it up on the internet. If you try a bit, you can easily out-earn your salary. I wonder why you didn't realize this when I was no longer dependent on you, especially since you are a public servant.
The truth is, the side job I chose was quite profitable. I won't say that anyone can make money from it. How much you earn probably varies from person to person. But my strategy, based on the skills and experience I gained while working in a major corporation's marketing team, was a huge success.
Well, that's how it is.
I said that and hung up the phone. Mark tried to say something, but I didn't feel like listening to the end. It would probably be something like, pay for me, or I need a loan. Hanging up the phone made me feel like I'd really severed ties with Mark. He probably had other debts that I'd been repaying, and maybe even new ones he'd taken on. Well, it's none of my business anymore. After that, Mark kept calling me for several days. He seems to have come to my family home when I was out, but my father sent him away. At that time, he reportedly said, "I want you to lend me some money." Just how greedy can he be? To think I used the money I earned to repay his debts. It was ridiculous. He should have relied on his parents, but apparently, he'd already done so. He'd borrowed a large amount from his in-laws, and had been disowned without my knowledge. I did feel a distance growing between us and his parents at one point. Mark had told me that his brother and his wife had moved in with them, so they were keeping their distance to avoid being a nuisance, but that must have been a lie. Unable to rely on his own family, he kept borrowing money to repay his debts. I always figured he'd eventually go bankrupt, but it came about surprisingly soon. In the end, he seems to have borrowed money from loan sharks, and even the city hall was hit by debt collectors. There were also harassing phone calls that caused the city hall's phone lines to go crazy, causing a big problem. Eventually, rumors spread, and Mark lost his place at work and resigned. I heard rumors that he is now unemployed and on the run from debt collectors. He has become less than a parasite now, more like scum. Having moved back to my family home, I decided to stay there. We're renovating the slightly old family home, and my mother is putting her heart into creating an English garden she's always longed for. My affiliate marketing is going well, and I'm not short of money. Most of all, I'm happy that I can spend the money I've earned on my own. Once the English garden is complete, I'm thinking of opening a cafe.